That's from me, and if you just say a couple of words.
Hello, 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 hello.
Oh, good.
Can you hear me?
Say again.
Hello, hello, hello. Can you hear me?
All good. So, good evening to everyone. We're a couple of minutes early, but I think everyone's here. So, thank you very much for coming. By the way, Joel, we got you meal tickets. Yeah. Thank you to everyone for coming. And I don't know how many people here remember that there was a time not so very long ago, because just in my childhood, so quite recently, where you could not get a drink on a Sunday unless you were a part of a private members club. Betty thinks that was a good idea. And there was no pub. I don't know where the nearest pub was.
Brinde.
Oh, that wasn't so
Queens
far.
and
It wasn't so far, the Queens. Nowadays it is so different. It occurs to me always that the dawn chorus is no longer the sound of some wonderful natural bird life, but is the sound of empty bottles being clinked through the village as the refuse people come to take them away. You hear it every morning. Vast quantities of alcohol being drunk every night, so it could not be more different. And to tell us all about that development from a sort of abstemious lifestyle to a drunken one, we've got Dr. Gareth Huws, and yeah, there really have been massive changes to the attitude to alcohol in this community and throughout the UK, probably. You've got a very distinguished academic career. You've got a master's in scientific concepts amongst young people, and then a PhD in something completely different on urban growth and that sort of thing. So a really broad background. And I think you're going to tell us a bit about the history of this movement that was so strong in Wales and in Anglesey in particular, I guess, but I mean mid-Wales too. So we're going to hear about Temperance. Thank you very much.
Okay. Wel, diolch Owain, diolch yn fawr iawn am y gwahoddiad I ddechrau gyn Bobby, a diolch yn fawr I chi am y cyflwyniad. Thank you all for turning out this evening. I understand this is your third meeting in this month, so you've been very, very busy. And I will be touching on politics as well later on, so you might get a surfeit of politics, but we'll see. A very eccentric and strange historian called H.T. Buckle said something like this. Great minds, he said, discuss ideas. Average minds discuss events. Small minds discuss people. And I can see in front of me tonight that I'm in the presence of great minds. There is no doubt in my mind whatsoever. And I hope I live up to your expectations on that one. I'm going to give you a sort of historical talk, but it's really not the talk itself which is of relevance. It's the ideas that surround the talk. So I want you to think of what I'm going to say as being a sort of central bit, but that it's supported by a sort of structure. And it's this structure, I think, which you'll be perhaps more interested in. I'm trying to be looking at the idea of perhaps what is truth and all the rest of it. And every now and then, I'll throw some questions upon here. They're rhetorical questions to a certain extent, but they are questions for you to think about by the end, if you wish. Right. Let's start with, as I said, great minds, but I will also be referring occasionally to events and to people. If you want me to switch my microphone off while that's going on, then you'll understand. So I'm going to start with my first question. I think this is, do I just point it this way? Oh, I'll just do it this way. There we are. Okay. No, I've gone the wrong way again.
The right-hand one.
Right-hand one.
This one, yeah.
Thank you. My first question, again, is, just to make you think about it, is, should we believe history? You know, we're going to be talking about history. Should we believe it? I know some people here. I can see faces, familiar faces. And you might say, well, I know that person. So why would he come all the way to Rosneki to tell lies to me? But I could remove the word history from there, and I could put the word politics in. And I could ask you, should we believe politics? Because they're related. And we have to ask ourselves, what is this idea of history? Why do we study it? Why is it important? So I'm going to start with my narrative, my story, if you like. And as I said, I'll throw in a few more questions as we go along. 2 words, temperance and moderation. If you think of temperance, I don't know about you, but I think about it as being something very narrow, something very judgmental, something which is not really perhaps fitting in with this age, as Owen was saying. But if I say moderation, then I think you'd all say, oh, I can't live with moderation. I'm probably, you'd all think yourselves to be moderate people. But in reality, the 2 words mean the same thing. The word temperance comes from the word temperantia, which in Latin means moderation. But historically, the 2 words were used differently. So I'll start off with 3 anecdotes fitting in with this idea of moderation, temperance. Let's go to Belfast. John Edgar was a Presbyterian minister in Belfast in the 1820s. We're talking 200 years ago. Successful, big chapel, big church in Belfast. But John Edgar was worried. Women were coming into his chapel, his church, with contusions, with bruises, with split lips, with teeth missing, sometimes with their arms in slings. And he would ask them, what's happened? And they would always tell him the same thing. Oh, I walked into a door. I slipped on the stairs. I tripped up. And he knew this was not the case. And one day, John Edgar, there was a group of women together, and he went up to them and said, look, I know this is not true. Tell me what's happening. And slowly but surely, the story came out. Belfast in the 1820s was in an absolute, it was growing, it was a boom town, a boom city. And it was because of one thing. A stuff called flax was grown in Ulster, and that flax was used to make linen. And because of the British Empire, and people being sent to India and Africa and all the rest of it, there was a big demand for linen. So there were linen mills being set up in Belfast, many, many, many of them. And because we got to the 1820s, we're in the Industrial Revolution. So these mills were working by steam, not just by water power. And because there was a demand for experts, for people who could look after machinery, for people who could get these steam boilers to work, they were headhunted. So if you worked for one mill and you had this skill, you could move on to another one, and they would increase your wages by a slight amount. But these men, and they were all men, and were misusing this. They were using this extra money. They were going off to what they called shebeens, which are illegal drinking dens, and they would be gambling. And they would come home, and there would be the usual row, and they'd spent all the money, and they didn't have the rent to be paid. There were debts, and so it turned into what we now refer to as domestic violence. And John Edgar was absolutely shocked by this, absolutely shocked. And he decided that he would start within his church a moderation society. There's another thing about John Edgar which is interesting. He had probably the best collection of whiskey in the whole of Belfast. If you went to visit John Edgar, he had this big cupboard, like a wardrobe. And you opened it, and there were just masses of whiskey bottles. And he was generous. If you called on him, he'd give you a glass of whiskey, and he was a popular man, as you can imagine. But John Edgar wanted to make some sort of mark. He wanted to make some sort of statement. So one morning, he opened his big cupboard, took out armfuls of his bottles of whiskey, took them upstairs, opened a window which overlooked the street, and then opened every single bottle and emptied them out into the street. The people of Belfast must have thought, this is strange rain that we've got at the moment. But he was making this statement. He was trying to say, if I can be moderate, then so can you. Let's cross the Irish Sea to another area where Textiles were being made. This is Preston in Lancashire. Same sort of situation, but this time it's cotton that's being made and not linen. The cotton mills of Lancashire, especially, were again growing, main part of the Industrial Revolution. And there we find that the mill owners were worried about drinking. They were worried about it because this is what happened. People would work 5.5 days a week in these mills. Women, children, men, everybody. They worked perhaps 10, 12 hours a day, and at lunchtime on Saturday, the clerk would come round and give them their wages. And most people would go home and go to the shops and spend their money that way and pay their money buy for the rent, all the rest of it. But some of them would go on the razzle. Some of them would just take the money and start drinking. And they'd start drinking at lunchtime on Saturday, and they'd drink throughout Saturday afternoon and Saturday evening and late into Saturday night. And then on Sunday morning, they'd get up, and by lunchtime, they'd start drinking again. By Monday morning, they were in no fit state to work. And they had this joke. They said, if you were Irish, you'd have a day off on St. Patrick's Day. We have a day off because it's Boxing Day, which is St. Stephen's Day. So he said, if there's a saint, you should have a day off. So they said, there's a saint which nobody's heard of. It's called Saint Monday. And because there was Saint Monday, you have to have a day off. Now, these people, you see, were taking the day off. But if they were working in a factory system, they were not there. But it meant that everything was passed from along the line. If they were not there, they were an essential component. And what happened was, of course, the whole of that line couldn't work. And they were sent home. So these people were incredibly poor anyway, were getting less and less wages. And the mill owners decided, we've got to do something. So they set up their own moderation society. People had to sign up to say that they would be there on a Monday. That's all they had to agree to, was to be there on the Monday. And there were perks. Every few weeks, the mill owners would send to these people bags of potatoes, bags of root vegetables. A cart would come around with coal, and there would be free coal for them. Then in the summer, the mill owners would open up their grounds, and in those grounds, there would be games and competitions and tea parties. And it was all jolly fun. It was all great fun. And all of this was because they were trying to overcome the idea of drunkenness. And the third example I've got are from 3 different places, but they belong to the same religion. There were Quakers living in York, just outside Birmingham, and in Bristol. And if I tell you their names, you'll know exactly what they made. The one in Bristol was called Joseph Fry. The one outside Birmingham was called John Cadbury. And the one in York was called Joseph Rowntree. They were chocolate makers. And their idea was that if people turned their backs on drinking and decided to go and eat chocolate, then that would be a new addiction which would be better than being addicted to drinking alcohol. Whether that worked is another thing. At the same time, what was happening was that somebody devised, a man called Coffee, had devised a still to make gin. And previously, the stills to make gin where you'd make a batch, and then you'd make another batch, another batch. But this still was a continuous still. It was running all the time, which meant that the price of gin was absolutely very, very, very low indeed, which meant that gin drinking was a big, big problem. So, beer, by the way, was quite acceptable. I'm looking around and some people are enjoying glasses of beer, and that was quite acceptable. There were pubs in Amlwch and St Gefni and in Holyhead where that was the Methodist pub, and that was the Baptist pub, and that was the Wesleyan, and that was accepted that they went to these particular places. There was prodigious drinking at that time. If we go down the coast here to Newborough, there is a receipt in the archives for a dinner for 12 people in the Hare Inn. That's H-A-R-E. I don't know anything about H-A-I-R. But the Hare Inn had 12 people there. In that one evening, they drank 2 bowls of punch, 2 bottles of whiskey, 1 bottle of rum, 1 bottle of brandy, and 52 quarts of ale. Now, a quart of ale is 2 pints. So you do the sums. There were 104 pints of beer drunk by 12 people in one day. But that pales to nothing compared with what else was happening. The end of the 1820s, there was a big demand for a change in the way people were voting. Previously, you could only vote. This is relevant now because we're only a week away from the elections. Previously, only landowners were allowed to vote. Ordinary people were not. And those chocolate makers and mill owners and ministers, they were not allowed to vote. They might have been well off, they might have been powerful people, but they were not allowed to vote. But change was in the air, and that change meant that people would be allowed vote. Some people, and men always, you don't allow women to vote. And men were allowed to vote. And the Whig candidate in the Carnarvon boroughs asked a colleague, look, there's all these new people voting. How do I get them to vote for me? And the answer was very simple. Oh, you bribe them. With what, he said. Oh, drink, he said. So this poor man, and this is absolutely tear-jerking, he set up a free bar in Carnarvon. Right? Carnarvon hasn't changed in 200 years. This free bar lasted for 3 weeks. And during that time, big figures for you, they drank 833 barrels of beer, 2,469 gallons of spirits, 2,204 bottles of wine, and the candidate was presented at that time with a bill for £13,000. So if you're complaining that you have to pay for a round of drinks at the bar, think about that poor man who was paying £13,000 for everybody in Carnarvon to drink themselves every single day. And I'm certain most of them weren't allowed to vote anyway. So there we are. So let's go to another question. Can politics affect human behaviour? We're within a week, as I said, of the election. You've had the hustings here, and a number of you have been here and heard candidates in Anglesey here. Can it affect, can a law passed in Parliament really affect human behaviour? It can affect things, other things. It can affect the law changes in the way things we can do, things we can't do. But can it affect human behaviour? Are we talking about the human behaviour 200 years ago being exactly the same as it is now? Well, we'll see. These people I talked about who didn't have the vote but were expecting to be able to be given the vote were pestering their MPs. We have a right to do that now, but it happened then. These people were living in large houses, they had connections, and they were putting the case forward that something had to be done about drinking. Now then, I'm always wary when Parliament and when politicians are given this sort of ruling. Something needs to be done. They almost inevitably ending up doing the wrong thing. And this was the case. The Duke of Wellington was the Prime Minister in 1830, and he'd had this message. Something had to be done about drunkenness. So his Parliament came up with this most credible act, which was called the Beer House Act. And the Beer House Act was probably the strangest piece of legislation that's ever passed. Up to that time, there were 2 places where you could drink. One of them were taverns, and the other one was inns. Inns were usually on the side of the road, so that people would be travelling from place to place, and they would stop by, and they would be given a meal, and they would have accommodation. Taverns where people went to drink, but they were controlled, very strongly controlled by the magistrates. A beer house was different. A beer house couldn't sell spirits, couldn't sell gin, but it could sell beer or mead or cider. And anybody could do it. All you had to do was give 2 guineas to the magistrates, and you were a landlord. People bought barrels of beer and put them in their front parlour. Then they'd open the window and sell beer through the window. People would bring a jug along and they'd sell the beer through the window. And that was the idea, which seemed okay. But these places became real dens of iniquity. There were fronts for all sorts of things. Some of them, there's one of them I know of, certainly in Holyhead. It was, you went in, and it was a place where you took stolen goods in order to be able to sell them, and somebody would buy them. It was like a Fagin's den. All right? Others where you went in, and they were only selling you beer, but if you went to the back room, there was gin and whiskey, which again, not allowed. And the others, sadly, were brothels. They were just fronts for brothels which were run quietly. Everybody knew there were brothels, but nobody actually said it. And Holyhead is another example. Because of the sailors coming into the port, then you had that. So, what happened? Why was this a failure? Well, very simply, it encouraged drunkenness. If you owned a beer house, you could open it at 4 o'clock in the morning. And people would go to the beer house on their way to work. Now, most people worked either as seamen, as sailors on ships, or they worked in quarries or in mines, or they worked on farms. Cyffin Williams' great-grandfather, the Reverend James Williams, was the vicar, the rector of Llanfernghornwy, in the north of Anglesey. And he wrote, he was taking a morning service at 8 o'clock in the morning. And there were people sleeping in the middle of the road. There were people draped over hedges and over walls. There were people in the corner being sick. And this was at 7:30 in the morning, and they were on their way to farms. The farmers were absolutely beside themselves. There was nobody to milk the cows. There was nobody to take the animals to the mart. There was nobody to plough. You couldn't fill somebody up with beer and then ask them to drive a plough along a field and hope to have a straight line. There was no chance that was going to happen. So there was this great to-do that there was the whole population seemed to go crazy. They were just buying this beer and drinking it and drinking it and drinking it, and obviously it affected society. And before anything could be changed, something rather remarkable happened here in Anglesey. A group of people came together in Amlwch and said, we need to do something about this. Because every one of those farm workers sent home, they were getting paid less, and it affected the economy, everything was being affected. And 63 people turned up in this first meeting. And they decided that they would call themselves a temperance society. So that's where the word comes in first of all. Within 9 months, the membership of that society had gone up from 63 to 3,500. And 1 year after that, the number of members had gone up to 6,700. The temperance movement started off at an incredible pace. Interestingly, of those 6,700, 490 of them had signed a pledge saying that they were not going to touch alcohol ever again. The rest were moderates. They were temperate in the sense that they were only taking alcohol, but only up into moderation. And this temperance society was actually a very, very good society, John. They loved processions. What they loved to do was paint some flags up, get banners going, and they'd walk through, probably they didn't walk through Llanfernghornwy because Llanfernghornwy didn't really exist at that time, but they walked through Llangefni and Amlwch and Holyhead and Sarachymedd. They would just walk through, and there would be band playing in the front, and there would be lots of singing, and it was all very good, and people thought, ooh, this is good fun, and people joined, and more people joined. Up to this point, by the way, this has got nothing to do with religion, except for the John Edgar and the Quakers. It had nothing to do. We tend to think of temperance as being very much to do with religion. At that time, it wasn't. So this growth in the temperance movement caused all sorts of side issues. People opened cafes and coffee shops because they sort of realised, well, if we've got 6,700 customers, then we're going to make a go of it. These were popular places as alternatives to these beer houses. The government eventually realised that they'd made a big boo-boo, and so the government changed the rulings as far as the beer houses were concerned. You had to have 6 references in order to start one of these places, and you had to, if you had drunken behaviour there, then they could close you down. But the genie was out of the bottle. Once the beer houses were in place, then they were there. And this is where we now talk about public houses. These were the pubs. Right? These were the pubs. The others were taverns and inns, as I said, but these were the public houses. And some of them continued, and even so, some of them are continuing even to this day under different management, of course. The perfect storm on this time was this. The government passed this change. The chapels now were trying to look for new members. Something like half the chapels that you see in Anglesey were built during the time between about 1820 and 1835. So it was a growth there as well, but they were all looking for people to sit in the pews, congregations. And that happened, but also in 1837, Queen Victoria came to the throne. And Queen Victoria represented respectability. The kings before that, you could never call them respectable. George IV was not a respectable man. William IV was not a respectable man in any way. He had so many children, I don't think he could count them all. But they had mistresses, they had drink problems, they were on drugs. They were a really strange bunch, these monarchs. But Victoria represented a sort of respectability, a sort of staidness, and this affected people. People tried to follow that sort of pattern. Temperance movement grows. It produces its own newspapers. And I loved reading through these, because what they did, the temperance newspapers, they took stories from other places and then twisted them to give them a temperance sort of viewpoint. There was a lady in Birmingham. She'd been out and she'd had a drink. And she came home, she sat down, and she burst into flames. It was spontaneous combustion, which some people believe is a thing. I'm still uncertain about it. And of course, the temperance said, we are, you see. You go off drinking, and this will happen to you. Now, I've had a word here now. If you see somebody sitting next to you smouldering in the next hour or so, please tell us, because we'll throw a bucket of water over you, and we don't want spontaneous combustion to take place here. And another one was, I found this is incredible. This is a letter written to one of these papers from a man in Monmouthshire. And he has this sort of, I can hear his tone of voice, so excuse me if I sort of try to copy it. He's talking about drunkenness. 'Tis the mother of all the moral evils which affect this country. Perhaps drunkenness is the greatest. 'Tis the mother of crime, the stepping stone to the gallows, the bane of civil society. It cramps the energies of the mind. It evacuates the senses. It debilitates the body. And it makes one look blue. Now, that last sentence is a really strange one. I've seen people going very red in the face after drinking, and I've seen people who are going to be sick, who've gone very, very pale and very white, but I'm not actually seeing anybody turning blue. So there's another job for you this evening. Not only do you have to look out for smouldering, will you look out for blueness as well in people sitting alongside you? The mayor of Cardiff at this time seriously considered the possibility of bringing back the stocks for drunkenness. Setting up the stocks or resetting up the stocks in the middle of Cardiff so that you could throw rotten fruit and so on at people. So, temperance movement growing, still a force to be reckoned with. By the 1850s, it's changed slightly because the railways have started arriving. Because the railways started, then the big brewers then were able to send their beer all over the country in a matter of few hours. So you have people like Bass and Tetley's and Whitbread and Incoop. These are names perhaps you're familiar with. These started sending their beer to Anglesey, to everywhere. And that was the end, really, for that time, of the small breweries. There were dozens of small breweries in Anglesey. 5, 6 of them, I know, in Holyhead, 3 of them in Amlwch, 3 or 4 of them in Llangefni. There was one in Llanfachredd, which was the one which lasted the longest. The Mona Brewery in Llanfachredd did go on until the end of the 19th century. But all the others, they just couldn't cope. They couldn't compete with these big brewers from away. Temperance still gained ground. If you go from here towards Llanfaelog and go through Llanfaelog to the A55, you cross over the A55 and go to the junction with the A5. On your right, you've got the recycling place. On the left, you've got Bryngwran. Are you with me? Yes, if you go straight on there, towards Llanrhychymedd, you come to a place called Trevor. And on the corner of the house in Trevor, there's a house called Temperance. That's the name of the place. And it's obviously, the name goes back to this time of when Temperance was a big thing. There was a coffee house in Llanfaelog. It's reopened as a social enterprise place. And that was because Lady Reid of Gareth Lloyd was very much involved with the temperance movement. And she pushed the idea of coffee houses. She closed the Holland in Llanfachredd because she owned the land there, and she just closed it because it was selling beer, which she frowned upon. And I suspect that the old Black Lion, which was outside Llanfaelog, that had to be built outside Llanfaelog itself because of temperance, because of Lady Reid of Gareth Lloyd. I don't know what she'd do about Gotwood Festival. I'm not quite sure that Lady Reid would really approve of Gotwood, but perhaps we shouldn't go there. There was a Talbot Hotel in Holyhead, which was very popular. If young ladies were travelling by themselves across the island, they would stay in the Talbot Hotel because it was a temperance hotel and it was considered to be safer for them. So there was that sort of thing. Oh yes, football. There is a connection, a strange one. There's a football team. And I keep forgetting its name because it's a very obscure football team. It'll come to me. Manchester City. Has anybody ever heard of a place called... You've heard of Manchester City. I knew you were great minds. I knew it. What's the connection? Is it the pub quiz question for you now? What's the name of the ground they play on? What's it called? Etihad Stadium. What was it called before? What was the old name? Main Road. Aha! There's your connection with temperance. Temperance had spread, not just in Anglesey, not just in Wales, but everywhere. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, North America, everywhere. There were temperance societies, and they were very, very popular, and some of them are still running. And the state of Maine in northeast of the United States passed a law which said that you were prohibited from selling alcohol, or buying alcohol, or making alcohol, or producing alcohol. And this story travelled across the Atlantic, and the temperance movement were beside themselves. This is what we want, they said. We want a law which says that you can't sell alcohol, you can't make alcohol, get rid of it. Of course, that wasn't going to happen. But the temperance movement in Manchester pressed the corporation and said, can we do something to remind ourselves about what Maine has done? And so the corporation changed the name of the street to Main Road. The name before, by the way, was Dog Kennel Lane, which doesn't seem to have the right ring. If you're watching Gary Lineker on Match of the Day, and he was saying, there's a football match in Dog Kennel Lane. So it was just as well, perhaps, that they changed the name to Main Road. But there is a connection. And the other one which I found, which I was quite pleasantly surprised was, I thought it had all disappeared because I'm a very old man and I have memories of things going back. I remember a drink called Vinto. And I thought it had gone. I thought it had just disappeared and there was nowhere, nobody actually. And my daughter said, oh, she drank Vinto. And I thought, my goodness, is it still available? And it is. You can still buy Vinto. Because Vinto was produced as an alternative to beer. It was the Vim Tonic Company, again in Manchester, and they produced this as an alternative drink, so young people wouldn't drink alcohol, they would drink Vimto. But I'm quite pleased to think that it's still available and still... And there were societies started, which were very much the societies with temperance. There was a independent order of Rechabites. They were like, I don't know, like Freemasons or like the Probus clubs or that sort of thing. And there was a Good Templars as well. So this whole idea of temperance was huge. Let me just try one more of these things while my luck is still in. Yes. This is again to do with the whole idea of the fact that we've got an election. In a democracy, is there a place for single issue groups? Because you see, the temperance group was really a single issue group. It was there for the very simple reason, for one reason and one reason only. And there are single issue groups which we're all aware of, and they do some excellent work. But can they sometimes force their own ideas on people? Can they change the agenda, if you like? Well, we'll come back to the idea of that. So, where are we leading to? Well, we're leading to probably the apex, the very top, the best thing that happened to the temperance. It's 1880 by now. And the temperance movement is very, very strong. It's now very much interconnected with nonconformism, especially in Wales. Not exclusively, but very much that the nonconformist chapels were supportive of temperance, and temperance was very much based on the nonconformists. And Gladstone came in with his Liberal Party in 1880. He was dependent on Welsh MPs in order to get the Home Rule for Ireland thing through his Parliament. And the Welsh MPs, and there were 33 MPs in Wales at that time, 29 of them were Liberals. In that Parliament of 1880, 29 of them were Liberals. And those Liberal MPs said to Gladstone, we want something in return. We'll support you with this Home Rule bill and the Land Act, which was taking place in Ireland, but you've got to give us something. And what they wanted was to ban the sale of alcohol on Sundays everywhere. Not just in Wales, everywhere. And Gladstone tried his best, but he couldn't get it through. The large industrial areas in Birmingham, Leeds, Manchester would never ever accept it. And the Liberals who represented the southwest of England and the home counties, they wouldn't accept it. But Wales would accept it. And so for the first time ever, an Act of Parliament was passed in London, in the Parliament in London, the House of Commons and then the House of Lords, which only applied to Wales. And what it was, of course, was the Sunday Closing Act. It meant that public houses, taverns, inns closed on a Sunday and created the thing which some of us perhaps still remember of a Welsh Sunday. Now then, the people who were in the temperance movement were actually misled to a certain extent, because politics is a dirty game, as you probably realised. The Liberal MPs knew that the Tories were being financially supported by brewers. Charringtons and Bass and Tetleys and Nincoop were paying money to the Tories. And so what the reasoning was by the MPs, if they could cut down on the profits of the brewers, the brewers then would have less money to give to the Tories, and therefore the Liberals were likely to win the elections. So you've got that sort of political aspect to it as well. This act, which was passed, actually lasted for something like 80 years. Incredible amount of time. But there was a flaw in it, and Owen has already referred to it. This place, I'm not saying but this place specifically, but certainly clubs. If you paid a subscription to a club, you did not have to follow the same rules. And a club could sell alcohol on a Sunday. And then you get this growth in clubs. There were liberal clubs. There were conservative clubs. There were places in the very depths of the Rhondda where every single one of the people there were completely socialists or even communists. And they were members of the Conservative Club for the very simple reason that they could get a drink on Sundays. So this was a flaw. There was a wonderful idea in Cardiff. They set up what they call Hotel de Mal, they call them, which was really a piece of rope. And then in a park in Cardiff on a Sunday, they would put this piece of rope up and form a square. And then if you went in, you had to pay a penny to go in through the gate. And if you went through the gate, or it wasn't a gate, it was just where the rope ended, then you were in a club. And therefore, you could drink on a Sunday. And the Cardiff Corporation tried every single way to stop this. And they said they had lawyers looking into it. They had it went to the court, I don't know how many times. And every time, the Hotel de Mal people won because they said, we're taking a subscription. You pay a subscription at the door, and therefore, it's not a pub. So, people were trying this out. As I said, the Act lasted really until 1961, where it was quite clear that the temperance movement, as it was not going to survive. And a new Act was passed then, as I said, it was 80 years since the original one, which said that any county in Wales could have a referendum, and if the majority in that referendum chose to, they could have their public houses open on a Sunday. And instantly, there was a referendum held in 1961, and Cardiff, Old Glamorgan, Monmouth, and Newport all voted at once. These referendum were to be held every 7 years. So the next one was 1968, and Breconshire, Radnorshire, and Flintshire, those counties along the English border, they all voted. And gradually, every single district and county changed and voted. And it was quite surprising that the last area to go was Dwyfor, the area of the Llŷn Peninsula, which didn't pass the referendum until 1996. So it's only 28 years ago, And this is something which had lasted since the 1820s. So temperance has been a major influence in all parts of Wales throughout that time. My story comes to an end there. That's the end of the history bit. But let's just think about some of these things and how they affect what's going to happen next week. The temperance movement and its connections with nonconformity were certainly the strong voice within the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party of the 1880 with Gladstone were heavily dependent on nonconformists and on people who were members of the Temperance Society. What happened then was that the Liberals themselves broke up, they split up. A group called the Liberal Unionists couldn't support the Liberals with Irish Home Rule, and they split off. They formed themselves into something called the Liberal Unionists, which then joined up with the Conservatives. And the name is still there. The Conservative Party is the Conservative and Unionist Party. And that's where the connection, the remainder of the Liberals, where there was a Liberal Party, but there was a more radical wing of it. The radical wing, where usually people would come up through trade unions, and they gradually moved away from the Liberal Party and into a newly formed party called the Labour Party. And so from that time to the beginning of the 20th century, you find that Labour is the dominant voice in Wales, and still is to a very great extent. And that was hugely important. The General Secretary of the Labour Party in the 1960s, a man called Morgan Phillips, was asked, is the Labour Party, he said, a socialist party? And his answer was this: the Labour Party has never been follower of Marx. The Labour Party has been set up by Methodism. That is, it was the Methodists, the nonconformists, which were the foreigners of the present-day Labour Party. So, as you go into your booth next week and as you vote, and hopefully the candidates won't offer you vast amounts of drink to bribe you, if you're going in there, remember the history of it. The Labour Party came from these roots. The Liberal Party came from these roots. The Conservative Party were heavily dependent on breweries to fund them. Plaid Cymru started in the 1925 as the Liberal Party started to go down after Lloyd George's time. Then the rural Wales felt that the more urban Labour Party wasn't for them, and so we get the Plaid Cymru being started as well in 1925. So all these candidates, well, most of them, I won't go into the smaller parties here, but the main parties here in Anglesey, their roots lie within this idea of temperance. And so, on that note, I will say, iechyd da, cheers to you all.
Well, thank you very much for an absolutely brilliant presentation. Just before we get into questions, there's a couple I just want to ask. That Amloch meeting, what year was that?
1820, no, sorry, the 1832.
So very early on.
Very early on.
And was that the first Temperance meeting, or did this thing start in Amloch?
It did start in Amloch.
Really? The whole national movement started?
No. There were similar sort of things were happening all over the place.
Okay.
But we know about the one in Anglesey for the very simple reason of this whole report about behaviour and farms not running and so on. So the Anglesey one started there, but the number of people joining was quite impressive.
And the other thing that struck me about what you said was I'd always assumed this was nonconformist religiously. It had its origins in religion, but it didn't. It had its origins in economics and social problems. And
people.
And then basically the religion latched onto it, and
that's it. Yes. Yeah.
So very interesting. And as you say, absolutely astonishing that basically this. I mean, I think when did the first pub come to Rosnigo? The first license was given in about 85 or something like that, or 1990, something like that. So I mean, it's over 100 years after the act. Yeah. Okay. We got the microphone. Any questions? Was that the first one? And what year was that?
So I can't tell you how long ago it was. But it was
quite recently.
Because it morphed. It started out life as the dolphin.
Oh yeah.
And then it became the honeypot.
Yeah.
And then it morphed into the new pub, which then became a Morra.
Right. So the first license was with the new pub. Yeah, probably. Yeah. Yeah. There's a question. Gus. You got a question? No. Yeah.
Gareth, thank you. Very entertaining. And I salute you in the traditional manner. And I was born in Preston, by the way.
Ah, right.
I don't know whether you saw the story in the papers today, or some of the papers, about binge drinking increasing among women in the UK generally by over 60%. Any views on that, and what constitutes binge drinking?
Yeah, well, the whole pattern is we've noticed that chapels have closed in Anglesey, but certainly pubs have closed as well. And the pattern now is people are buying their drink and drinking at home, and this sort of, you haven't got the same sort of regulation in that sense that people could be drinking all day, every day. So it's a social problem, and certainly drinking has become, if you go back to the 1850s, 1840s, drinking and drunkenness was considered to be a police problem. It was a legal problem. People were drinking, and therefore they were being caught, and therefore they were being punished, sent to Primaris jail, and all the rest of it. But by now we understand addictions, we understand drinking, we understand mental issues involved with it. So when you say that binge drinking amongst young women, at the time I'm talking about, the only young women, I'm sorry to say, that were in these pubs were certainly were the ones in the very low places in Holyhead, which had, and they were there to do their duty. They weren't just sitting there drinking. They were entertaining, shall we put it that way?
Trollops.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk tonight.
Okay.
My mother, when I was young, instilled into me that moderation in all things was a good idea. When I got a bit older, I did ask her, did that apply to adultery as well? do you have any restrictions on moderation? But on a more serious note, just as an interest, I was in Scotland some years ago, and the rule there in Scotland was that you could only drink on a Sunday if you were more than 10 miles away from where your home was. So the roads were very full of very drunken drivers every Sunday afternoon.
Just as the microphone goes over, yeah, you describe those incredible lists of drink in a dinner or something in the what, 1830s, 40s.
1824 in
Dickens is like that, isn't it?
Yeah,
Dickens, they drink fantastic amount. Was it weaker?
Yes, they called it small beer. The percentage alcohol, because that was the beer was being brewed locally. So once the big brewers were sending their beer, then the level of alcohol did rise in it. But yes, certainly those small breweries they had no hops here. That was the problem they had. Because they couldn't have hops, it couldn't be preserved. So the beer went off very, very quickly. So,
yeah.
Thank you, Gareth. Fascinating talk. Temperance strikes me as not necessarily a movement against alcohol, but a movement against alcohol abuse.
Yes.
And I was taken, and like many other people, I thought the whole thing, the Sunday thing, was a religious, was primarily a religious thing. But we'll all remember 3 o'clock in the afternoon in a pub, the bell went, and you had to go, and then you have to come back at 5:30.
That's it. Yes.
It sounds outrageous, but that wasn't too long ago.
No.
And just on, I think it was Gus, but the pillar's in the way. But I recognise Gus's voice from over there. Is the binge drinking thing? Once they eliminated the 3 o'clock curfew, as it were, the binge drinking reduced.
Yes.
Because people would just go bananas before 3 o'clock.
Yeah.
So they could get through to 5:30.
That's it.
Yeah. So, my question was, do you feel it's a movement against alcohol abuse rather than...
There was a lot of talk about drunkenness, you see. That drunkenness was considered to be wrong in so many ways.
Yeah.
And of course, that is where you got not just abuse, but overindulging in alcohol, the binge, if you like.
Yeah, and the other thing that surprised me was the cities voting against the abolition. Because the cities were where the mills were and where all the work was.
Yes.
So the Monday mornings were quite important to those people. So that surprised me that they all voted to carry on.
Yeah, you got at different times there now. When I was talking about Preston and that we're talking about 200 years ago, we're talking about 1820s, 1830s, when the Sunday closing came in for cities like Cardiff and Newport. That was in 1881. So you had a 40, 50 year gap there, if you like, and things obviously had changed. The Victorian society was much, much stronger by 1881 than it was in 1841, when she'd only just come to the throne.
Gareth, thank you very much. Brilliant talk, really enjoyed it. So I was thinking about your questions as you went through, and the one that says, can politics affect human behaviour? And the thing that came to my mind was the ban on smoking in pubs, which did change, I think, human behaviour, I think. And for a while it made it quite unsavoury in pubs, didn't it? Because suddenly you could smell the urinals and everything that hadn't been, or the carpets that hadn't been washed for ages and ages. But it did change human behaviour, didn't it?
Yes. Whether there were fewer people smoking as a result, I'm not sure. That is, if people just go outside and drink and smoke, then their behaviour is still the same. It's not, they're not doing it within the walls. But the intention probably was that there would be a decrease in the number of people smoking. Yeah. And similarly with this whole idea that beer was considered to be acceptable. The common man, if you like, would drink beer. But once you got into the idea of spirits, then that's when the sort of...
Yeah. Well, beer used to be, small beer, like you say, used to be the way to drink healthily rather than drink poor water.
Yeah, well, exactly, yes.
But the other thing that struck me was the other big legislation on licensing hours was due to the First World War, I think, and it was again Liberal government that brought in the licensing hours that was there to allow munitions workers.
Yes, to increase productivity.
Increase productivity. Exactly. And I think that's probably where the 3 o'clock thing came.
Yes. You limit the hours they were opening.
There's a question over there, and just as it goes across. So this is a Welsh thing, and Gladstone did it for Wales. We all associate Scotland with, Presbyterianism, hardcore Puritanism. But they never had it.
No. They tried to bring it in, as I said, for the whole of the UK, but they didn't have enough support.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. My grandparents in North London had signed the pledge.
Right, yes.
They were non-conformist. This was in against the immigrant Irish in Paddington and Euston, who were a rowdy lot, and these rather straight-laced non-conformists had signed the pledge in reaction to this. You haven't mentioned gambling. Now, my grandparents were dead against gambling as well. This was tied up with their temperism, and I wonder what you have to say about that. In fact, my grandfather wouldn't even let us buy raffle tickets.
Right.
Because this was gambling.
Yes, that's where you step over from the temperance movement, if you like, into the more strictly Puritan and conformist tradition, which was a slightly different thing. The temperance one did lead to legislation. Except that the gambling eventually did as well. We have a series of gambling acts. But once you got to this idea of the sort of Victorian and then later the Edwardian sort of respectability, then gambling was considered to be very, very wrong. Again, it was because of the breakdown of families that were taking place. People would get addicted to it, as they do to drink or to smoking or whatever, and that destroyed families and created debt and all the rest of it. So there was a reason for that sort of I can understand why your grandparents would take that sort of, because they would have seen people becoming bankrupt and all the rest of it. Which was really quite sad. We've got to accept that the way of life was very, very, very different. I was telling you about the people in Preston. They were working 65 hours a week. This was not a cushy job in any way at all. None of them were. I'll tell you one thing about temperance, which was more recent. I knew a man in Holyhead, as it happens, in the 1980s, and he'd signed the pledge just as your grandparents had done, and he'd gone to sea, and he'd been at sea for the whole of his life. Now then, people who are mariners who are at sea are renowned for drinking and over-drinking and visiting ports and so on. But he went around the world, and everywhere he went, he did not drink a single drop of alcohol. He kept that pledge for the whole of his life. And I was talking to him, and he was an old man. He was 80 at that time. And he said, I'm really worried, he said, because his doctor had said that he needed to thin the blood in his veins. And the recommendation was that he drink a tot of whiskey before going to bed. And he was quite shocked because he couldn't think of himself drinking whiskey. And he went to see his minister, Mr. Roberts, in Holyhead, and said, look, I'm really, really worried about this. This is a crisis of conscience. I've kept this pledge, which I took when I was 14 or 15, and I've never, ever broken it. And the doctor said, the minister said, look, I've been in the same situation as you. I've been taking a tot of whiskey for 10 years. And it's kept me alive. And I think that if we keep you alive, it's more important than allowing you to die early. So, you know, that was the fact that people could keep that, not just for a week or 2 weeks. You know, we make New Year's resolutions. We break them by the second day of January sort of thing. But these people were able to keep these for decades. Absolutely incredible.
Gareth?
Oh, yes.
Hello.
There, over there.
Gareth?
On the left.
Oh, sorry. I was looking there. I thought, oh, the ventriloquism.
Gareth, diolch am eich sgwrs hwych.
Croeso.
You talked about the mill workers getting drunk all weekend. How could they afford it? And was there ever any discussion about taxing alcohol in that period?
They afforded it by going into debt, very, very simply. They ran huge debts, which they depended on their wage in order to pay off some of the debts. But of course, because they were missing out on Mondays, they were getting 1/5 less of their wages than they would anyway. So it was a completely vicious circle that they ended up just getting poorer and poorer and poorer. And of course, it affected their wives and their children even worse, because they were also, very number of cases, were actually working in these mills, but their wages were very much lower. So it was a really difficult time, and you know, as the lady said there, gambling did come into it as well. People could lose. I've seen people lose a week's wage just on playing cards, you know, and you tend to think, how on earth can they survive on that? And this is, you know, recently doing some work with the Citizens' Vice in Holyhead, and it was, they just...
Terrible to see.
Yeah, it is a sad indictment.
Question, Charlie.
Thank you. It's not exactly a question, but I was very against it. And it's nothing to do with temperance, because I was in a partner in the Sandymount Club, and we were chock-a-block on a Sunday. I was very upset.
So Sunday trade was good for you?
I know, yeah, it was.
Yeah.
I noticed, by the way, that you've got a glass which you've got Tetley's on it. So Tetley's is still... they were one of the main brewers going back.
Hello. Once again, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. Can I just go back to the meeting in Amlwch that you spoke about, and the 63 people that then grew to many thousands of people. You did say that a few hundred signed an agreement to totally abstain.
490,
alcohol, but the rest continued to drink in moderation.
Yes.
And that was their take on temperance. Did it remain that way, or did the movement eventually take temperance to mean abstinence?
This was an interesting one, because, as I said, as the movement grew, and as the nonconformists were hovering around, if you like, and looking for people to be members of their church rather than somebody else's, some of these denominations insisted on full temperance. The independents, or the Congregationalists, as they were called, they wrote to all their ministers in Wales and said, you must sign the pledge. And a number of the ministers said, no, we're not going to sign completely like this. and it was, you know, it was held against them. They were really not as such punished, but they were put in a position where they were being forced into making a declaration that they were signing the pledge. So the signing of the pledge grew more within the nonconformist grouping. You could be temperance, but not nonconformist. Theoretically, you could be nonconformist, but not temperance. But that really was getting fewer and fewer people were able to go into that. I have examples of chapels here in Anglesey where they would hold Siat. Do you know the word Siat? A Siat was a sort of court held in these chapels on a Sunday night once every month. And you would have the whole of the chapel in front of you, galleries as well as, and there are examples of chapels where you had 1,000 people there, and there would be an accusation made that John Jones had been seen coming out of a pub, right? Not drinking, not drunk, no proof more than that, and he would be expelled from the church, from that chapel, in the first instance for a month, then perhaps 6 months. If he kept doing this, then he'd be taken off the and by being cut off from the chapel, that person then was cut off from the whole of society. It was a absolutely cruel way of doing it, because you were standing there with no representation, no support, and you had 1,000 pair of eyes all looking at you, and all being judgmental and saying, you know, oh, he's been drinking, you know, that sort of thing. And that obviously was wrong to a very great extent.
And what years was that sort of thing happening?
Oh, this was right up until, certainly until the First World War. The Vrytle Chapel, again, I come back to Holyhead because I had a lot of work on there. The Vrytle Chapel there had their records going back to 1870, 1880.
Okay, got one here and then a couple down here. Yeah, we'll come to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I found that very, very entertaining and, very educative, and lots of things I had no idea about. A couple of things have popped, well, several things have popped into my head. One of them, literally from the last point. Last weekend, I was down in Plymouth, which is where I went to college, and when I first moved there, I didn't have, I wasn't eligible for the halls of residence as a student, and I found digs, which only when I got there did I find out it was with a family of a Salvation Army family, and I turned up with a box of homemade wine and a motorbike, and it didn't go down terribly well. And when I moved in, the room that I was then renting for not very long had a big hole. The door had a big hole kicked into the bottom of it, and I found out that the room that I was then occupying had belonged to their daughter, who was had been thrown out of the house, literally because she'd been seen in a taxi with a man. I suspect from the conversation that we've just been having that then, you know, she may well have been to a club or a pub or something like that. And that was 1980.
There we are. That's
it. So that I found that profoundly shocking.
Yes.
And that just popped into my head.
Yes.
So I'm going to just very quick. The other quick thing was the person, the MP who tried to buy votes with alcohol. Did they succeed? Yes or no?
Yes, they did. They did actually get the seat. The Whig did with it, but he was a much poorer man by the time.
Thank you. And then
because MPs weren't paid, you see, at that time. MPs were not paid. You had to be self-sufficient, if you like. You had to be have your own funding to be an MP. The idea of paying MPs didn't come until really the end of the 19th century.
Okay, thank you. And then, sorry, just one last little thing. As you were talking, you spoke about spontaneous combustion, which of course made everybody giggle. Nobody's getting too red. But I was also thinking about how much David, my husband, would have enjoyed this talk, and he would have really enjoyed it, and that linked with spontaneous combustion to anybody who has not watched the BBC's adaptation of Bleak House, which of course is is just one of the best bits of, I think there are probably half a dozen episodes, I can't remember. If you want to sit down on a winter's evening and start watching that, where you have the most wonderful character called Crook, who is played by Johnny Vegas, who does spontaneously combust.
Yes,
and it is probably one of the best bits of television you'll ever see. Thank you very much, Gareth.
Thank you.
Yes, so David was the founder of this institution.
Ah, right.
Yeah. So we've got 2 questions here, I think. Yeah.
We've known about alcohol as a race for a very long time, and we've developed all sorts of ways of dealing with it, from in primitive societies, customs, and so on. And we've had whole religions. The Muslim religion forbids the use of alcohol.
Yes.
America had prohibition.
Yeah.
Even in Ireland, famous for drinking, I remember being there in the West as a teenager and discovering that the only night on which the pubs shut on time was Saturday, so that people would be in church.
Yes,
for
of
mass
course. Yes.
in the morning. So it's quite a wide field. I believe that now half of the population of the UK does not drink very regularly.
I can believe
Is that about right?
Yes, I would say that as a good. Strangely, you mentioned Ireland. There was, until fairly recently, because these have been taken over by big companies and so on, but the pub owners, the pub landlords in Dublin, a majority of them, a great majority of them, were temperance or teetotalers. That is, they had the attitude that yes, you could come into these pubs and they were full of the Irish, the crack and all the rest of it, but they were there to make money. And if they were going to be sitting there drinking the stuff, then they weren't going to make money. And those who did drink it, well, they didn't make such a good show of it. So quite surprising.
Yeah. Just a quick one, really. What percentage of the island was either involved in the temperance movement or the nonconformist movement?
Oh, I can't give you an actual figure, but it was absolutely, you're talking 80-90% of people would have some connection to a chapel, and through that they would come on to the idea of the temperance. You had 2 types of chapel goers. You had people who were actual members of a chapel, and people who were what they called visitors. So you'd often find that somebody would go to a church in the morning and have the service in church. But because they liked the hellfire and the preaching and the way the chapels ran, they would go to the chapels in the afternoon. There was a census, incredibly, in 1851, there was a religious census carried out to find out how many people did actually go to chapel. And the percentages are somewhere in the region of 75-80% in any one Sunday, which they took a snapshot of the census.
Thank you. And you said earlier that some houses wouldn't even have a glass in the house. Because
because it was a symbol of a drink could have been taken.
Great talk, thank you.
There's a question, Betty.
Diolch, Gareth.
Croeso.
Sgwrs wych. I was just wondering, with the chapels, how did they deal with I can't remember the thing that come in.
Yes, communion, yes.
Yeah, how did they deal with the drinking of the...
Oh, it was a non-alcoholic wine.
Was it?
Yes. Only the church the church had to have fermented liquid, they called it, to serve in communion. But the chapels had there were companies who actually sold you this stuff. Absolutely horrible stuff. Absolutely.
That doesn't happen at all there.
Oh, they still have communion, but they still won't sell. There won't be alcohol in it.
Oh, so it's still the case?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I didn't realise. Okay, well, look, thank you very much. It's an absolutely brilliant talk and a fascinating topic, and I guess everyone's quite interested in alcohol, so that's a good start. We've got one more, yeah.
Very quickly, I understand, I might be wrong here, I understand that alcohol consumption amongst young people is falling.
That's it.
Currently.
Yes, yes.
If that's interesting.
Yeah. Again, people are making decisions themselves now. The decisions before were being made by the society they lived in or the chapel they belonged to and so on. Now people are making their own decisions based on their own health or whatever, which is a good thing.
We've got the assistant manager of the club. I'm not sure that's right. Anyway, maybe. Good. Thank you very much for a very excellent talk, and you really brought that to life. So thank you very much indeed. Brilliant.
It's all okay.
So.